Good afternoon, and welcome to the ADU track of the 2020 Boise Neighborhood Interactive. My name is Susan Eastlake. I am a founder of ADU Simplified, a group of Boiseans with a mission to help the city of Boise expand the annual growth in ADUs. ADU Simplified proposed that the 2020 Boise Neighborhood Interactive include an ADU track with 3 separate presentations. The city agreed, and here we are. My family has lived in Boise for over 50 years, in neighborhoods on the Boise Bench, the North End, and Southeast Boise. In each of these places, we found a community of friendly neighbors, almost all of whom were of the same economic status and living in single-family houses. This is primarily how Boise has developed. The presenters in this first session of the ADU track are going to recommend to you an alternative housing option, additional housing option for these existing single-family neighborhoods. Many of you have already seen an ADU in your neighborhood. Some have not. I hope by the end of today's presentations, you will understand why ADUs are an important addition to Boise's housing stock and how you can help spread the word, or perhaps yourself become a part of the solution. As a rapidly growing city with a shortage of affordable housing for our expanding essential workers, ADUs provide close-in rental accommodations for singles and small families. ADUs can also house aging relatives or college students. And for a homeowner who is willing to be a landlord, ADUs can provide additional income. So get comfortable and get ready to be amazed by the talented, knowledgeable, and experienced presenters who are here to make you fall in love with ADUs. This first section is why ADUs, and will be moderated by Jerry Brady. Jerry, please introduce yourself to our viewers.
Thank you, Susan. I'm a relative newcomer to Boise, unlike you, and I have been fascinated by the old neighborhoods and the first bench, fascinating places. And so I bike all over this city. And I recently biked the North End, and I noticed a lot of ADUs, and I started writing all the alleys. And here's what I found out. Between Harrison and 4th Street, there are 60 ADUs. Foothills to Front, Harrison to 4th, 60 ADUs. Some alleys have 5, some have 3. Many have 1 or 2, 60 in a very short. Now we think of the North End as the ritzy place, the expensive place. And of course it is, it's 50% more per square foot than the rest of the city. But it has ADUs. In fact, it's had the ADUs for a long time. People with small dwellings in back of big dwellings. It's worked very well. It's helped economic development there. It's helped the schools. It's been a net plus to everyone. My job here is to be a moderator. There's nothing to it. I'm going to introduce Corey Riddle. Corey Riddle is the Deputy Planning Director, the Deputy Director of Current Planning for the City of Boise. He will introduce to you 2 representatives of AARP, who will introduce to you 2 representatives who are working on protecting the rights of the disabled and to ensure that we all comply with fair housing rules. It's my pleasure to introduce now Corey Riddle, Deputy Director of Current Planning for the City of Boise.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I guess I'm here to talk to everyone about ADUs today, and specifically why ADUs or accessory dwelling units. While it wasn't official, I think the reason for my attendance is to share my perspective, I suppose, is what some of you might call a bureaucrat. So with that, the city's vision, or really area of emphasis moving forward with new leadership, is to create a city for everyone. And that's going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. No right or wrong answer. But as it relates to our discussion today, we're really focused on creating a home for everyone. And I think with that no longer means a detached single family home on, say, a quarter or half acre lot. Certainly, at least not here in Boise. The pattern of large lot development that consumes huge amounts of land are probably effectively gone for the most part in Boise. If not by choice, simply because we're running out of land. And obviously, we have a quickly growing problem in terms of affordability. So before we go much further, I want to just briefly introduce myself. Believe it or not, planners are actually people too. I've worked for the city of Boise for about almost 17 years now. I was born here in Idaho, and absent short sabbatical in rural Nebraska, lived here my entire life. I'm the son of a couple of Idaho Vandals. My wife of 24 years and myself are also both proud Vandals. We have two daughters, one a junior centennial, and my oldest a junior, again at the University of Idaho. Also, as you can see here, proud parent of a 3-year-old basset hound. My little family lives and breathes Idaho and Boise. It's all my girls have ever known. I share a little bit of this background because I'm not just interested in housing from a professional perspective. It's very personal to me and becoming very real. My daughters are going to be looking for housing very soon. And if we as a community don't change our ways, they simply won't be able to look in Boise. Affordability is obviously towards the top of the list when you think about the benefits of ADUs. They certainly do provide more affordable housing alternative to some of the average home price, which I think cracked $400,000 in Ada County now. But I don't want to focus on numbers. It's really not my area of expertise. I would note that, our fees and impact fees are roughly half for an ADU of about a 1,400 square foot single family home. But again, affordability is just one of the benefits of ADUs. It's a form of housing that actually has very minimal impacts on our neighborhoods. And you often don't even know they're there. They're able to use existing infrastructure, which is definitely preferable than extending services to previously undeveloped or undisturbed areas. They're also generally located in close proximity to existing services and amenities. All of this obviously has a host of benefits also from a sustainability perspective, not to mention the added livability of the homes for the new residents. Again, not everyone wants to live in that larger home in a conventional subdivision. These accessory dwelling units are actually quite desirable to a growing number of people. In terms of numbers, between 2008 and 2018, we permitted about 140 accessory dwelling units. These were approved based on older ordinance standards, but we recognized a while back that we were missing an opportunity to provide additional housing. So last year, as many of you may be aware, we worked on amending the development code to encourage the construction of more accessory dwelling units. Specifically, we proceeded with a simple amendment to our ordinance, with the hope being that it would provide minimal, or impacts would be quite minimal. The changes included increasing the size we now allow by 100 square feet and allowing a second bedroom. Our hope was that those two simple changes would make these ADUs more conducive to providing housing for maybe a small family or perhaps a single parent. We also eliminated the requirement for parking for the 1-bedroom accessory dwelling units, which is the majority of what we see. Finally, the amendment allowed on-street parking to count as parking for those 2-bedroom units. And counting on-street parking spaces towards that requirement is actually still somewhat of a novel concept in our code. Now, it's probably a little bit too soon to tell. There's certainly market demand could certainly have a lot to do with it, but it seems that our code amendment is making a difference. As I mentioned before, between 2008 and 2018, we permitted about 140 of these accessory dwelling units. But since amending the code last year, we've permitted about 94. And I looked late last week, and I think it was around 12 to 15 of those were those two-bedroom units. So I think we're making progress. The amendment was certainly a step in the right direction, but we can do more, actually a lot more. I think it's fair to say the city could look at additional changes to code, perhaps even revisiting the way we permit this sort of thing. From a development code perspective, I think we've probably only scratched the surface, and it's probably time, if we really want to make a difference, that we think outside the box a little, maybe even push the envelope. Maybe we allow larger accessory dwelling units on bigger parcels, or even 2 ADUs in certain situations. Perhaps we could explore opportunities to condo these units to promote home ownership. We might also revisit the current requirement for owner occupancy of one of the 2 units when an accessory dwelling unit is allowed. We actually pursued that a little bit with our last code amendment and met significant opposition. A number of folks were concerned that we'd just be creating neighborhoods of exclusively rental properties. Some even suggested that we would perhaps just be creating a bunch of short-term rentals. The world has changed quite a bit since then, so I think it's fair to say we haven't given up. Those are just a few ideas, honestly, or food for thought. Nothing that's a formal city proposal. Really, just ideas to generate thought as you get started with this conference. If the community is serious about making a difference in this housing crisis, though, I think it's going to take more than just the city. We can all actually do more. It's not just our responsibility, because we simply don't have the tools to address all of this. For example, if you go back to that map, you will see the majority of the accessory dwelling units are permitted in older parts of town. You might ask why. I'm sure there's a number of factors, but I think one big factor is the absence of CC&Rs in a lot of these older parts of towns that simply prohibit this sort of thing. Those restrictions are in place in a lot of the newer subdivisions. It's not going to be an easy sell, but that might be one of those things that does need to change. But it's not something the city can do. That's a private agreement with homeowners and their homeowners association. Maybe if you're in financing or the banking industry, there are different ways to approach this sort of thing. If you're an architect or designer, maybe you can create code compliant plans that are effectively pre-approved by the city. I've heard of this recently in other locations, and could certainly be a way that we reduce cost and time for those interested in pursuing an accessory dwelling unit. There's probably all kinds of things that can actually be done, and frankly, need to be done. In the spirit of time, I think that wraps up really what I wanted to share. The session was called Why Accessory Dwelling Units? And quite simply, I think because we have to. I think we're running out of time. As you're all aware, our housing stock is dangerously low, and the housing that is being built is largely untouchable for many of us, probably most of us that are listening today. I think if you're here, it's because you do care, and it's all of us that need to make a difference. I think it's actually our obligation together to ensure that Boise does remain a city for everyone, and accessory dwelling units are just one small way we can help. So with that, I think you're going to hear from a few more folks here I guess it's this afternoon now. Next from AARP, Bessie and Tom will be speaking to you. So thank you.
So it is my pleasure to present the AARP session of YADUs with my colleague, Dr. Tom Trotter. And we start with an often used definition of ADUs, which is a contemporary term for a second, smaller home built on a parcel, usually zoned for a single detached house. They come in many shapes and styles. They are family friendly and a community creating type of housing. ADUs are affordable housing options, an important aspect of livable communities, able to house people of all ages. They are built to just the right size, generally between 600 and 1,000 square feet. They're eco-friendly, they're good for the environment, compliant with building codes, and they can be integrated into all of the neighborhoods. So ADUs are an American tradition. Early settlers often built a small home to live in while constructing their larger primary house nearby, utilizing the space as an ancillary building when no longer a residence. When farming was a source of survival for most of the nation's households in an agricultural economy, families routinely constructed additional homes on their land as needed without restriction. An historic precedent for the modern day ADU is the carriage house or coach house. These structures, originally built for horse-drawn carriages, were associated with grander homes, frequently large enough to double as living quarters for workers and stable hands. Decades later, in response to housing shortages and economic needs, many surviving carriage houses were converted into rental homes. Automobile garages have a similar history, some of which were built with a housing unit upstairs. Over time, many garages were converted into small homes when the spaces became more valuable for housing people rather than vehicles. With the rise of suburban single-family home developments after World War II, ADUs practically ceased to be built legally in the US, with some cities grandfathering in pre-existing ADUs as long as they were continuously occupied. ADUs are accommodations for aging in place. They allow homeowners to stay on their property for both financial and emotional investment. They provide a home for a loved one in need of care, whether the person needing care moves into the ADU or as a place is created for a caretaker to stay. ADUs provide housing for relatives or friends, again, whether the homeowner moves into the ADU to downsize and for purposes of mobility, and family members occupy the main residence, or family members or friends reside in the ADU. They allow homeowners to rent to provide extra income while increasing the value of their homes. Space can be used for house guests or as pathways to boosting affordable housing options. They allow homeowners to keep connections to their communities and neighborhoods, providing them with a comfort in their familiarity with local services such as pharmacies and grocery stores, and of course, to feel safer with someone living nearby who cares for them. And now Tom will talk a bit about livable communities.
Well, thank you, Bessie. And I think in order to maybe compress, summarize, if you will, I think it warrants asserting that more Americans prefer to age in place. And in order to accomplish this, they're going to need affordable and appropriate housing options, enter ADUs, in neighborhoods that are characterized by, among other things, walkability and having transportation options available to them, also having access to supportive services and other amenities. We tend to refer to these kinds of neighborhoods as mixed use neighborhoods, and they are situations into which ADUs fit, I think, quite appropriately, quite comfortably. Next slide, Bessie. So, in overall perspective, AARP has conceptualized community livability as a constellation of 7 areas of interest, which taken collectively define the concept of livability. These are depicted in these 2 slides as, first of all, housing, which pertains to affordable, I might add, eco-friendly and accessible options, neighborhoods that enable residents to access life, work, and play kinds of resources. And I'm not going to bother to spend a whole lot of time in even succinctly defining the balance of the 5 aspects of a livability index. You can see them on this particular slide. They include the environment, transportation options, health services, engagement, and lastly, opportunities. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, once again, we're going to be primarily interested in the housing and neighborhood dimensions. Next slide, Bessie. So to determine how your neighborhood measures up, we encourage community decision makers and other interested folks to consult what AARP has developed in the Livability Index. And I might add, in kind of picking up on Cody's initial presentation, I think that the outcomes of what a user comes up with in inputting the Livability Index, it also can evidence-based need for additional, in this case, affordable housing. So to determine your community's livability, which, by the way, taps metrics and policies as scoring standards that were drawn from a pool of 60 indicators that are identified by, or rather that were identified by a norm group of nearly 5,000 Americans that were sampled at the time the livability index was created. You can call up your own neighborhood, actually at the micro level, neighborhood's livability score by entering the zip code for this particular neighborhood into the window that you see on the left-hand side of this slide. What you can end up getting is, as you can see off to the right, a profile which consists of, first of all, a total or composite score, which reflects, if you will, scores that were assigned to each of the component areas of interest that we reviewed in the preceding 2 slides. And these subscale scores emphasize, again, how a neighborhood fares as far as health, as you can see, housing opportunity, et cetera, and so forth. And what you see is Boise City's profile with a composite or total score of 64. And you can see arrayed beneath that particular score how they measured up as far as each of the 7 content or areas of interest scores are concerned. Know that scores range from 0 to 100. They're color coded by their placement in either the bottom, the middle, or the upper 1/3 of the distribution of scores. Each subscale is featured on separate pages that will accompany the profile when you call it up, with fuller descriptions for each subscale score and area of interest that lists the very specific metrics and policy statements that were used in rendering the subscale score that is featured not only on the profile sheet, but in the subsequent individual area of interest sheet. Okay, Bessie, next slide, if you will. So while there is some diagnostic value available in the outcomes of the livability index, we can develop perhaps a more complete picture of community livability by combining this little piece of quantitative data, the livability index scores, that is, with other qualitative measures like structured questionnaires, and AARP has what they call a livability community survey, which can be administered to anybody and everybody who happens to be a resident of a neighborhood or a community. Interviews with selected stakeholders, focus groups, photographs, video recordings, document reviews of information that has been accumulating over time, asset mapping, which takes a look at the resources to which neighborhood or whole community residents have access. Once again, once all of this expanded information is collected, and we would call such an evaluation that focuses on mixed methods evaluation, both quantitative measures and qualitative, as maybe a thick collection of information across, again, quantitative and qualitative measures. We would categorize, look for patterns and themes, if we will, once we scrutinize the information that's been collected, categorize this data into selected areas of interest. And Bessie, if you wouldn't mind moving forward to the SWOT analysis. Many of you I know are probably familiar with the SWOT analysis. It's been around for ages, but nonetheless, we seem to think that it is particularly germane to making some sense to framing, if you will, the kind of data that we collect, not only through the livability index, but from the embellishing this through more qualitative kinds of measures. So imagine looking for patterns or themes in this thick data that you will have collected across measures. In selected areas of interest, and again, for purposes of this conversation, we're interested primarily in housing and the neighborhood dimension. Note what could be perceived as strengths and weaknesses, and these are more present tense in nature. This is what we see when we do the assessing. Also consider what we might think of in terms of opportunities and threats as well. These are a little more futuristic in orientation. So from a prescriptive standpoint, now keep in mind up to this point, we've been more diagnostically oriented with the index, again, coupling the index scores with more qualitative kinds of measures. From a prescriptive perspective, and Bessie, if you wouldn't mind fast forwarding to the next slide, please. Oh, there we are. We can convert, and many of you once again are familiar with how SWOT analyses work. You can convert weaknesses and threats, and I prefer to refer to weaknesses as challenges, if you will. You can convert weaknesses and threats through a little bit of wordsmithing to strategic objectives. And you'll want to prioritize this as a group of decision makers. Opportunities and threats, opportunities can also, I should say strengths and opportunities can also be converted through wordsmithing and perhaps even a little bit of embellishment to strategies for action planning purposes. So there you see featured on this particular action plan. There's nothing magic about it. It's a fairly standard action planning protocol. Objectives.
Dr. Tom, we're going to need to wrap this up in 2 minutes.
You bet. Well, let me then segue on to Bessie, who's going to talk about maybe where opportunities can take us in planning.
Yes, thanks, Tom. So AARP has community challenge grants, and they have done this for the last 4 years and distributed $6 million across the nation. This is an opportunity annually for application. As we can see from the slide, housing has represented only 7% of all the awards that have been given out. In 2020, there was $2.4 million given out to 184 communities, including the state of Idaho. The national office gave out $48,000 in grants to the cities of Cascade, Glens Ferry, and Gooding. And the state office gave an additional $16,000 to Jerome County and Idaho Falls. So again, just pointing this out as an opportunity for affordable and accessible housing and ADUs in terms of putting your application in. And our last slide is the AARP has a wealth of livable community resources. You can find these at aarp.org livable, including information on ADUs, such as the ABCs of ADUs and ADUs, the future of housing. So please feel free to access this website of aarp.org/livable. And for any questions that you might have, just go to the aarp.idaho website and you should be able to get those questions answered. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Zoe Olson, Executive Director of the Intermountain Fair Housing, and I believe she will introduce Mel Leviton for us. So thank you.
I'm Mel Leviton. I'm the Executive Director of the Idaho State Independent Living Council. Briefly, our mission is to promote independent living and for people with disabilities across the state. And what that means is that people are able to live in their communities and not in institutions. And now more than ever, we probably see that there's a real need for that for health reasons. I guess I was brought onto this to talk a little bit about just briefly disability rights and access to affordable housing, and access being not just having enough money for the house, but being able to get into the house. And I always find it a bit humorous when I look at different pictures of affordable, accessible housing that's 2 stories with a garage in the back and steps up to the front. I always get a kick out of that because I'm in a wheelchair and those houses aren't available to me. They're not even available for me to visit. We do a statewide assessment every 3 years. And I've completed 2 of those now in my 5 years here at the State Independent Living Council. And every time housing, affordable housing is at the top of people's list. Affordable, accessible housing is the next thing on the housing concern list. We talk to people who live in mobile homes, who have tried to age in those mobile homes and they can't because there's no ramp to them, especially people who are renting. They're concerned about trying to put in a ramp. They don't understand that a landlord, generally speaking, will let someone put in a ramp. They need to let someone put in a ramp. It's just going to be the tenant's responsibility to pay for it and then have it removed when they leave. ADUs really offer a great opportunity for affordability and accessibility. I live in one. I have a 0 entrance, meaning I just get to roll right straight into my house from ground level. There are no stairs anywhere on our property. And it's really wonderful. I live really close to some housing that we were discussing in a meeting earlier today, where it's an old mobile home park with really a lot of RVs in it, in fairly dilapidated condition. I'm not one of those people that looks at that housing area and says, oh, that's such an eyesore, it needs to go away. I look at it and think, what are they going to do when the city decides to flatten it and not affordable, not accessible housing goes in? Because I talk to people practically on a daily basis who are priced out. Somebody who is on SSI this year is making $283 a month. If they can't get a housing voucher, then they're forced into either having a roommate or living in institutions. And we're seeing more and more, especially older people, forced into going into group living situations. I think ADUs just offer a lot of opportunity to avoid that, to make our communities richer. They also bring some difficulty, right? So where I live, wonderful house. I have no sidewalks in my neighborhood. And I'm not very far off of Fairview, but Fairview, for anybody who's looked at those sidewalks, they're really dangerous for people in a wheelchair, either a power chair or a manual chair. So there are neighborhood things to think about when you're looking at and I know people know this, but I don't think you know it until you've tried to roll down the street, until you've tried to get to a grocery store. So it's not just a matter of having these in the north end where it's more expensive, but really critical to have them throughout Boise, throughout the valley, I think throughout the state. I've lived across Idaho. I've lived in northern Idaho, north central Idaho, eastern Idaho, lived in all the different climates of Idaho. I graduated from Idaho State. I've only been in a wheelchair for about 20 years. So my perspective has changed over time. I think everybody's perspective changes over time, what you can afford and what's accessible to you. A real plus in having the units owner occupied, and I was one of the people who answered the survey, and I see a real plus to having them owner in one house or the other, is that you build a relationship and you look out for each other. We really look out for our landlord really looks out for us, and that's really a great thing. I've owned a home and mostly rented, and I've got to say this is the best situation I've ever had. And I just got a text from Zoe, and I think there may have been some miscommunication because she's getting ready to be on the one at 3:15. So I'm just going to pass that along to Cody. Maybe Cody, you're the one who will handle that. I'm not sure who's going to handle that. Anyway, I'm sure there'll be lots more to learn about the ADUs throughout this week. I know I'm involved in a couple other presentations, as is Zoe. Then I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Mel. That wraps it up. Thank you, everyone.